Hi, this is Steve Wagner, and this is a brief lecture on leadership and ethics. I'll start out by defining ethics and then discuss why ethics is so important for leadership, and we'll close out by discussing the PREE model of ethical thinking. So what is ethics? Ethics is derived from the Greek word ethos. That means customs, conduct, or character. So that's interesting if we look at that. It has to do with customs. That means something that is shared across people, across time. But it also has to do with character. So it has to do with both what the individual and what society says is appropriate or desirable. And it has to do with conduct. It has to do with whether a person is virtuous and whether the motives for action are virtuous. Why is leadership and ethics so closely tied? Well, think back to our definition of leadership. Leadership has to do with an individual influencing a group of individuals to achieve a shared goal. There is influence here. Is it appropriate influence? There is power differences between leaders and followers. And so that creates an ethical responsibility. And it's important that a leader's behavior be driven by virtuous motives. Leadership requires respect for other people, and you need to understand the interest of others. Again, there's this idea that people should be treated as ends and not as means to an end. Leaders often are making decisions. There's ethical implications, either implicitly or explicitly, in making decisions. Leaders often create a climate for how many people behave in the organization, so that leaders are a model that other people follow. And so it's important to create and reinforce positive organizational values and an ethical climate. The choices that leaders make and how they respond to particular circumstances need to be informed and directed by their ethics, because that will have an impact on how others in the organization behave. So if we look at theories of leadership, it's not uncommon for them to address ethics. Two in particular I'd like to address are theories of transformational leadership, and another theory we'll look at in a bit called servant leadership. But in terms of transformational leadership, this was first studied by Burns and later by Bernard Bass. There's a strong emphasis on the values and morals and needs of followers. Leaders help followers to get through the struggles that they have with conflicting values. And often when we look at ethics, it involves ethical dilemmas where there are conflicting values at stakes, where we may be considering what is the greater of two goods or what is the lesser of two evils. So in transformational leadership, there's often stress on values of things like liberty and justice and equality. And if we look at the theory of transformational leadership, especially how Bernard Bass has looked at this, again, he talks about different factors or different facets of transformational leadership. One is idealized influence. This is that the leader conveys values to followers. The connection between the leader and the follower, if it is idealized, then may raise the level of morality in both the leader and the follower. Also, if you look at another dimension that Bernard Bass talks about, he talks about individualized influence. And so the leader needs to think about the individual needs of followers and assist followers in thinking about their values and help them to achieve a higher level of ethical behavior. Another theory of ethical leadership is servant leadership, and this has very strong altruistic ethical overtones. Here, Leaders are meant to be servants. They're meant to serve the followers, not. And we oftentimes think about leadership the other way around, is that followers are serving the leaders. But servant leadership says, no, we turn that around, and the leader should be focusing and attentive to the needs of followers. They should be empathizing with followers and nurturing those followers. Servant leadership also says that there's a social responsibility that leaders have concerned with the have-nots in the organization. This is reminiscent to the leader-member exchange theory of leadership, where we've got an in-group and an out-group. So servant leadership says we need to look at that out-group and try and remove the inequalities and the injustices that keep them on the outside. We need to look at why they have less institutional power, less control over what gets done in the organization, and try and create more equality by shifting authority to the followers. When we look at servant leadership, oftentimes the values of involvement and respect and trust and individual strength are emphasized. Through being a servant leader, the leader can address followers' needs, helping them be more knowledgeable and more autonomous, acting on their own, and that they in turn, again, will follow the model of the leader and become more like servants and serve other stakeholders, the customers, the community, other people in the organization. Looking back at transformational leadership and servant leadership and their implications for ethics, we see that they really emphasize two areas: that ethics involves values, and that ethics involves the consideration of others, okay, a motive of caring. And certainly these are important perspectives to consider when we're thinking about how to act ethically. Okay, but there are other perspectives, and so I wanted to introduce to you what I consider a fuller model of ethical decision making that helps you to consider a wide range of ethical considerations. And this is called the PREE model, P-R-E-E. And the idea here is that before you act in terms of acting on ethics, you should think. And the PREE model says, okay, you become aware of a situation requiring the consideration of ethics. Take the time to think of various ethical perspectives before you act, but then act. The PREE model, P-R-E-E, stands for principles, responsibilities, end results, and empathy. Okay, so let's look at these in a little bit more detail. First of all, principles. When you've got a situation that requires the consideration of ethics, you need to think about what are the principles that are important here, the values. And you can think of your own values. You have personal values that you have. But you should also think about what are the organization's values and what are the values of organizational stakeholders, other employees, customers, the community. When you identify these things, you need to think specifically, how do these principles relate to this situation, this ethical dilemma that is being faced? And are there principles or values that are conflicting with one another? Okay, is there a situation where we're considering the greater of two goods or the lesser of two evils? And if so, you need to think about and make a decision about how you should prioritize those principles in this situation. The next thing you need to think about are your responsibilities, because ethics has to do with obligations that you have to act appropriately. And so, first of all, you need to think about your formal role in the organization and what are the responsibilities of your formal role. Also, you should look at the profession that you're in. Perhaps you belong to a professional association, and they often have responsibilities that are prescribed to professionals in that area. So whether it's accounting or human resource management or MIS, there are usually professional standards that have been established that should dictate your behavior and that you should be aware of. And also, you should look at the parties directly involved in the situation that you're examining. What are the responsibilities of those parties involved in this situation? Next, let's think about end results. How can you act in a way to achieve the most favorable outcome for the greatest amount of people? Okay, what is the greatest good for the greatest number? And next, you need to think about, in terms of enacting these end results, would you be comfortable if the decision that you make and the actions that you take are known to everybody that matters to you, to your coworkers, to your family, to your friends, to your community? Finally, we need to think about empathy. We need to think about how can you address this situation with consideration for all people involved. How can you respond in a way that demonstrates respect for and maintains the dignity of those people involved in the situation? Well, thanks for listening to this brief lecture. I hope it makes you think more about how you can act as an ethical leader.